Hey there, spooky friends, and welcome to another episode of the Scaryish podcast.
Woo.
I'm Robin Grace. This is Adam Diaz.
Hello.
And today we're here with a couple castles to share with you folks. I say castles because your topic is named Castle, and my topic's kind of named Castle, and they are very different topics.
Yeah, they could not be more different, in fact, I don't think. I'm going to be covering Castle Bravo. Robin, what are you going to be covering this week?
I'm going to be covering the Murder Castle.
Interesting. So, I'm not sure how we should title the episode, because I definitely want to have H Holmes in there, because he's a big name, and I want people to be able to find the episode pretty easily, but also the name Murder Castle is just so badass. It's kind of hard not to include that. So it might be a rather long title. Not exactly sure how that's going to look. But either way, it's going to be an interesting topic. And it should be a fun episode. But before we get into that, let's go over what we've been doing this past 7 days, if we can even remember any of it. Robin, what's the last week been like for you since we last did a topic episode?
I feel like we haven't done anything notable. I don't remember doing anything. I feel like that is every week is just go to work, do this stuff.
So many of the days have blended together. Robin worked twice today. She went to work, she came home, she slept a little bit, she went back to work, she came home again. So when we were done doing our scripts, she was like, what day is it again? Because it feels like the week has been so long already and it's only Monday. So it's, I know I said this the exact same thing last week, but it just seems to be happening more and more often. So hopefully we can have some of those easy weeks in our outside life soon. That would be really nice. I don't think it's going to be this weekend.
Well, we're going to be going to Fanboy Expo. We actually have a vendor booth at Fanboy Expo, so we'll be selling a bunch of different stuff there in Vegas. If you're going to be there this weekend, come by and say hello. Absolutely.
We'd love to see you. And then, less than 24 hours after this episode releases, I'll be in the air flying back to Vegas. So I'm going a little bit early, getting stuff set up in the house, and then you show up a little bit later than that, and it's just going to be a whirlwind adventure for at least another 7 or so days. So hopefully we're able to get through it all with a high energy level, or at least an acceptable energy level, but we'll see how it goes. So I believe I'm going to be going first this episode, if I am not mistaken.
Yeah, you do you, boo.
All right, so like I mentioned, I'm going to be covering Castle Bravo. So this week, I spent the first hour of the script writing time that we had set aside telling the story of what happens in the movies Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction to Jess and Jules at the table, because I love those movies so much, and they had never seen it, and they seemed like they actually wanted to listen. I realized after the fact, every time I talk about something and I'm super excited to talk about it, it takes me 5 minutes once I'm done talking to just regret everything I've said in general. Because I'm just I feel like everyone wished I would have stopped talking 5% of the way into when I spoke, and everyone's just too nice to say something. It's kind of funny because I feel that way for everything but this show. So as I say that, who knows, maybe people get to my part of the episode and they just hit fast forward 90 times, but that hopefully isn't the case. I really do like talking about movies, and those 2 movies are 2 of my favorites, so it was fun. I feel like we should have just recorded that and just made it an episode of Scene Missing.
Yeah.
This podcast we can never seem to get off the ground. But anyways, that has literally nothing to do with my topic this evening or morning or afternoon or whatever time it is. I don't know when you're listening to this, but I think those 3 things should cover all the bases. Robin mentioned she's covering a castle, so to speak, so I wanted to cover a castle myself, but mine is going to be a little different. So without further ado, I present to you, dear listener, Castle Bravo. So I should tell you up front, in case you're picturing a wonderfully majestic castle with a moat and a drawbridge and a portcullis and towers and battlements, this is not that type of castle. It's actually a designation or a nickname for this particular experiment, which was inside a series of experiments. That series of experiments was called Operation Castle. So what was Operation Castle? It was a series of high-yield nuclear tests run by the United States government in various locations in the Pacific Ocean of a chain of islands. So yeah, obviously by the fact that this is on the show, you could probably guess that these experiments, especially the one called Castle Bravo, probably didn't go according to plan, and that was absolutely the case.
I feel like when you're working with nuclear weapons, it's just bad ideas all around. Like, I don't know how they expect anything good to actually happen from testing them, you know?
I mean, when you're testing a nuke, you're just blowing it up, you know? And like, there's a bunch of different things that I understand scientists want to measure when you do that. We're talking about a detonation, an experiment that took place March 1st, 1954. So this is a long, long time ago. This is a year before my dad was born. You know, there wasn't a whole lot known about the atomic bomb at the time, except like they were just trying different things to make it blow up bigger.
You already know what it's done. You know, you've already seen the damage it can do. What else do you want to do with it? It's just weird.
So this is, you know, and I'll get into this in my script a little bit, but this is a direct result of the fact that the Cold War was going on at the time. So there's just this escalation of these massive arsenals that the two superpowers were building up. And they were just kind of testing things / showing off at the same time. But 1954 was a long time ago. But that said, y'all remember 1954, right? Average cost of a new house in the U.S. in 1954, $10,250. Average salary in the United States, $4,100.
That's an annual salary.
That's an average annual salary in 1954. And even though that seems low, that is around 40%. Your average salary was 40% the cost of an average new house, which is shockingly close. In case you're wondering how that stacks up to today, or at least 2021, this is probably the scariest part of my topic, not any of the other horrific stuff I'm about to cover, but the average price of a house in 2021 in the United States is $269,039. The average salary in 2021 in the United States is $51,480. And if you're wondering how that scaled, that means in the last 67 years, houses have gone up by 26.25 times the amount that they used to be bought for. You would imagine that salaries would have gone up the same amount, right? Because, I mean, that's just what, you know, should happen. But nah, dog. The average salary has gone up 12.56 times, meaning that the discrepancy that's grown between the gap is roughly 14 times the amount that you would want it to be when it comes to the scaling of prices, which is why millennials can't buy a fucking house nowadays. Hashtag just saying, but that is neither here nor there. Cost of gas, 21 cents. A new car, $1,700. And if you were renting a place, the average rent in the United States was $85 a month. Notable events in 1954, Jackie Chan was born.
Aww.
So was Denzel Washington. I did not realize that they were both 68 years old.
Wow.
The first mass vaccination of polio, or against polio, I suppose, began in 1954. And of course, McCarthyism was a huge thing. If you all remember McCarthyism from U.S. history. McCarthyism is a huge hole to get down. It's a long, sad story of Americans using propaganda and fear to control other Americans and basically point fingers and call people names. And it worked really, really well for a short amount of time. Tell me if you've heard this one before. It might sound similar. What fueled this was the fact that the Cold War was going on. The United States and Russia were at each other's throats post-World War II. The two superpowers were constantly positioning themselves against the other, measuring their dicks on the world stage by doing things like blowing up massive bombs and making the explosions bigger and bigger and bigger. When the USSR at the time used to detonate these massive bombs, they used to compare the results to cities around the world. So they'd say, this bomb that we just blew up, if we take the radius of the explosion, we put it over, let's say, Paris, and they would show exactly the damage that they could do to Paris. And they do it with New York City and Washington, D.C.
It's fucked up.
Just to send that message of, like, this is what we're planning. So the U.S. was doing the same fucking thing. And the U.S. had a little bit of more scare tactics when it came to the locations, because Russia would basically do these in the middle of nowhere. They had different tests that happen in different locations. The U.S. would do these things in the middle of nowhere as well, but far away from the United States, and in fact, they'd be closer to nations that they had to deal with, so to speak, in World War II in various ways. So it's just another way that they were trying to intimidate people, basically, in 1954. That's what Operation Castle was about. It was literally multiple tests to try out new materials to see how to produce higher and more precise yields to better predict how big a bomb was going to blow up, basically. Castle Bravo was actually the first in a series of 7 tests. Think about your lifetime and how many nuclear bombs you've seen detonated as a test.
0.
7 tests in 43 days. They're going to blow up 7 thermonuclear devices in the course of 43 days in 1954. That is fucking crazy. The device for Castle Bravo was known as Shrimp. Shrimp was kind of an ironic nickname, like when you call a tall guy tiny type of thing. Because that device itself was 23,500 pounds. And it was 15 feet by 4.5 feet of a cylinder. So one of the densest cylinders you could ever think to see. Its yield, so the power that it's supposed to go off with when detonated, was supposed to be 6 megatons, later reduced to 5 megatons based off the math. For reference, 5 megatons would be 333 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, Japan. The tests were being conducted in the Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands in the Pacific Ocean. If you don't know where that is, it's okay. A lot of people don't. It's in a pretty remote location that's around 3,300 miles off the northeast coast of Australia. It's about the same distance from Australia as it is from the island of Japan, which had suffered 2 nuclear bomb strikes 9 years prior. So the proximity to that is already sort of just this intimidation move, without a doubt.
I just imagine that those islands don't grow anything or have any living creatures there anymore.
They were remote. They were still inhabited, though, which is one of the most shocking things. But they set things up where they could basically have their bomb be detonated and have these remote islands be where they're stationed at to observe and record the information. The intention was to make sure that these islands didn't suffer any sort of after effects from the explosions. But we'll get to that. I mentioned it's 3,300 miles away from Australia. If you're wondering, how far is 3,300 miles? I'm terrible with distances. The U.S. is 2,800 miles wide.
Wow.
So it's pretty far away. Like, it's closest to Australia, but realistically, it's still pretty far away. So they got everything ready. They built the bomb. They built it in, I think, Los Alamos, New Mexico. They measured it with these precise exactness. They sit and figure out how everything is going to react on a molecular level to anticipate how a bomb will explode, like the how of it, not just how big it's going to be. And like I mentioned, it was built in New Mexico. Then it gets transported around the world. They set up a bunch of instruments to test and record the explosion. There's a bunch of videos of this particular explosion. And then, at 6:45 a.m. local time, March 1st, Shrimp was detonated. Freeze frame! So picture a bunch of people on island surrounding the testing site watching. Because there were. Picture scientists and soldiers, probably a few politicians wanting to be present. Picture a bunch of sailors on boats nearby watching. Picture the locals, the people who actually lived on these islands. Just picture them all watching this test. And in this moment where they're frozen, to understand what they saw, you have to slightly understand how they built the bomb, all right? Now, the core of the bomb, the primary part, is called the sphere. I should just say it's called the primary. It is a sphere, essentially. It's designed to explode inwards and essentially condense a piece of material that causes a reaction that leads to the nuclear explosion that we've all seen, the mushroom cloud style thing. There is also another part that's like a cylinder, or it looks like a tumbler that you would put like water into. That's called the secondary. That's primarily filled with other things that are going to fuel the reaction that happens. So it doesn't need to be present in the sphere, but it's there to basically get to the yield that they're trying to attain. In this case, 5 megatons. All right?
Okay.
In the tumbler, sometimes they have things that are reactive and things that are not. For instance, lithium-6 was the isotope present in the secondary that was reactive that the scientists anticipated would fuel the explosion, along with another thing I'll get to. They calculated the yield based off of lithium-6. When you calculate a yield, it serves to tell people, above all else, if you're testing something, how far away they need to be, you know? This thing's going to blow up this big. This is where we should set up our shit so we don't die.
There's a shock wave, right, that comes off, a shock wave that comes off of a nuclear explosion,
Absolutely.
too. Is that calculated into it?
Yeah, they should be calculating every single thing because you don't want to destroy your assets that are there to record the explosion or monitor the explosion or the people that are there. So, that said, when they're calculating this yield and telling people how far away they need to be, they also calculated the lithium-7 that was part of the equation in the secondary. Now, lithium-7 is a different type of isotope. So lithium-7 is different than 6 because it is considered to be inert, meaning it's not going to react or fuel the explosion. In other words, it's not supposed to do shit. It's just sort of there because they need to have it there for different reasons. Mainly because when this stuff goes off, on a molecular level, the stuff they figure out is like, what's going to gain a neutron, what's going to lose a neutron, what's it going to create, will what it creates help fuel the explosion, that type of shit. So lithium-7, everything that was there was basically considered to be inert. It wasn't going to do anything. In other words, when it went off, it was supposed to absorb a neutron and turn into lithium-8, which would decay almost immediately. Unfreeze, okay? That picture that you had of everyone watching, it unfreezes, but play it in slow motion. And while you're watching it in slow motion, picture their faces lighting up as this bomb, which was detonated in the atmosphere, not underwater, not underground, it was above ground in the atmosphere, lights up the sky. And
Does
while
it also
this is
light up their faces and burn it off?
No. While this is in slow motion and this scene is playing out, just imagine my voice as a voiceover if this were a movie or something like that. So lithium-7 actually, in reality, doesn't absorb a neutron like they believed. When it's bombarded with energetic neutrons, it undergoes nuclear fission. When that happens, it directly affects one of the other things that was present in the bomb that I mentioned, and I said I'd get to, and I'm going to get to it now. So in that split second of detonation, the thing that it affects the most is the uranium that's present. Now, picture those people's faces in real time, and it just lights up this blinding light because they see a fireball that lights up the sky that was 4.5 miles in diameter.
That's
the fireball from the explosion.
A lot of miles.
4.5 miles wide. It could be seen from 250 miles away. The mushroom cloud from this explosion was 47,000 feet high immediately and had a diameter of 7 miles 60 seconds after the explosion took place.
Insane.
That's how much this cloud mushroomed. At the 10-minute mark after the explosion, the mushroom cloud was at a height of 130,000 feet into the upper atmosphere at this point.
So what happens then when it's that big?
Well, the first thing that happens is it leaves a crater in the ground at the site. I told you how big it was, about the size of a dresser. So even though the device...
bomb was the size of a dresser?
About the size of a dresser. I mean, it's 17 feet wide or so it's a pretty big dresser, but a 17 feet wide device made a crater that was 6,500 feet wide and 250 feet deep. That's over a mile wide for those of you counting. I think 5,280 feet is a mile. So mission accomplished, right? Well, no, not exactly, not at all, in fact. The bomb that was supposed to go off with an estimated 6 megatons, at max 5 megatons estimated, actually detonated at a yield of 15 megatons.
That's exponentially higher.
It's 3 times higher than they thought it would be, which is shocking because the bomb went so much bigger than anticipated, and because the reaction that caused it to triple its yield, primarily through the uranium, one major thing happened. Uranium isn't something that they had anticipated when they're figuring something called the fallout, because uranium, when it affects bombs, affects them in ways that, I don't know, the best martinis are. Dirty.
Oh, okay, dirty bombs, got it.
I thought about saying, the spooky friends, and I was like, nah, I don't know people, I don't know if they're dirty, I don't want to get weird like that, but yeah. Basically, it turned this nuclear explosion that was supposed to have a low fallout into a high fallout explosion of epic proportions. That particular day as well was very, very windy, and there had already been discussion about aborting the detonation due to safety concerns for the near 20,000 people who inhabited those islands. After the explosion, the U.S. military knew something had been seriously wrong with their math. They noticed how much radioactive fallout was coming down, which essentially falls like evil snow. The personnel involved in the tests were rushed into fallout shelters, including the naval vessels which were on the water. They were told to shelter in place and shelter in their holds.
All I can think of is the game Fallout and all their Fallout shelters, all the vaults and stuff like
Everyone
that.
freaked out. They hid for 7 hours before the levels were determined to be acceptable to step out into. The naval vessels were almost all ordered to nope the fuck out immediately. There was actually a ship called the USS Patapsco that was in the area in late February, which got kind of lucky. Well, how do you ask? Well, they didn't have a decontamination washdown system. So because of that, the leaders are like, just in case anything goes wrong, you guys should probably get the fuck out of town. Just leave so we don't have to worry about it. Unfortunately for the USS Patapsco, their engine had a flaw where there was a cracked cylinder, which meant that they could only go at 1/3 their max speed. When the test happened on March 1st, they had already been long gone. They were 190-ish nautical miles away.
What is that in like
regular miles? 219. I don't understand why they have to be different. Okay. Nautical miles and regular miles, it's just confusing. But 219 regular miles away when the explosion happens. By March 2nd, the next day, the USS Patapsco reported fallout landing on the ship almost 300 miles away.
What?
Yep, that's how far it had been blown by the wind at this point. They were advised initially that the fallout that was falling was harmless. They also had no radiation detectors aboard the ship to tell whether or not that was true. Spoilers, it was not true. When the ship finally reached Pearl Harbor, it was measured and showed to have levels ranging from 3.3 Roentgens, which is a unit of measure for measuring radiation that we don't really use anymore. It's a legacy measurement, from 3.3 to 18 in various parts of the ship.
Why, yes, Adam. Why don't you tell me what that means?
Okay, so a Roentgen basically is not used anymore. No one knows what it means. 18R, or Roentgen, essentially equates to 1,679 chest x-rays.
That's a
lot
of chest x-rays.
If you feel uncomfortable taking that many chest x-rays, you probably would have felt uncomfortable on this ship as it sailed to Pearl Harbor, which the sailors absolutely were.
So did they all die of radiation poisoning?
They did not die. Several of them got sick. They didn't disclose a lot of the stuff because it was, and still is in a lot of cases, highly classified. The stuff that happens to the citizens and the people that they did not intend within the U.S. military to be affected, however, is not classified because they can't classify that shit and they had to own up to it. Like the Japanese fishing boat that was outside the original expected area that was exposed to the fallout after the explosion. Most of the crew got severely sick due to radiation sickness. One of them died of acute radiation exposure 6 months later, as well as another who had a child that was stillborn. It took a total of 48 hours after the explosion before the islands to the northeast in this particular island chain were completely evacuated. The northeast is the direction the wind was blowing that day, and enough radiation, enough fallout had accumulated where they realized that they needed to leave. And I'm not just talking about a quick temporary evacuation. They were taken off the island, and they would not be brought back for years, literal years. The fallout, no pun intended, from this massive fucking mistake was substantial. The Japanese expressed concerns about the testing and the lackadaisical attitude shown by the U.S. The fallout that was being spread around the globe was a direct result of their error, and the Japanese were really worried because of the proximity to them and how fresh in their minds it was of what had happened to their country 9 years prior.
It was only like less than 10 years, right?
So they're just like, dude, we fucking get it. Like, why are you doing this over and over? And if you're gonna do it, why are you not taking safety precautions to prevent innocent people from dying? The U.S. basically answered with a lie and stated that even though the bombs were getting stronger, they were lowering their radioactive fallout. And while that was true in general, it was absolutely not true for Castle Bravo specifically. Later, when they were forced to admit they were full of shit, they sent Japan around $15.3 million in compensation, with the victims that were exposed receiving around $5,500 each, which would equate to $56,000 in 2022 money.
I mean, they could buy a house back then.
Yeah, but
or not buy a house. That's an annual salary, right?
Yeah, that was an annual salary, but $5,500 each. The average U.S. house at that time was $10,400. But imagine you were out on a boat fishing. All of a sudden, you were exposed to radioactive fallout that would change your life forever, and they're like, "Here's $56,000 to make up for it." It's like, are you fucking kidding me right now?
Oh, 56,000, not 55. I thought you said 5,500.
5,500 in that time, 56,000 in 2022 money.
Oh, okay.
So I'm telling you, if it happened now, imagine how you would feel if your compensation was $56,000.
Okay.
The residents of the islands that were evacuated were told they could return to their homes. In 1957, 3 years after the incident, it's 2 a.m. and my math is not good right now, the Atomic Energy Commission actually deemed that it was safe for them to return after getting back. They noticed that their normal foods that they had grown, like arrowroot and other locally sourced vegetables, along with the fish they were catching, were making them severely ill. They reported this information to the Atomic Energy Commission, asking whether or not the island was actually safe. At that point, further tests were run on, the things these people would have to eat to survive for the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
And as soon as the results came back, all inhabitants were completely evacuated yet again.
Because it was highly radioactive.
Yeah, they're just like, oh yeah, we forgot. It might not be glowing green anymore, but it's probably not safe to fucking eat anything. I couldn't find official word on when they were actually brought back, but eventually they were brought back. There were islands in the region, though, that were not evacuated. In total, 15 islands were affected and contaminated by this fuck up, and I think only 3 of them were evacuated. Up to 10 years later, there were repercussions for these inhabitants of the island, like developing tumors, suffering from general radiation sickness. Pregnancies over the 10-year period saw around 70% of all pregnancies on these islands have issues as a direct result of the fallout contaminating the area. Individuals in this area were 60 times more likely to develop and die from leukemia, thyroid cancer, and cervical cancer.
Wow.
Compared to the rates within the mainland U.S. population at that time. The U.S. government sent money to those people on the island over the course of the next 40 years as compensation for their lives and health being in literal ruins by this mistake.
Yeah, like if you can't catch fish that isn't going to kill you, you know?
They stayed and they just didn't leave and they suffered through it, man. And the U.S. announced that the funds for taking care of these folks had officially been tapped dry in 1995, 42 years after the incident. It is stated that the amount that was sent due to this incident was roughly $43.2 million in total.
I like that they're like, the funds are tapped dry.
They're like, we don't have anything else. Even though the wind initially was heading northeast to start, Japan, India, and Australia, which were all to the west, did have significant amounts of nuclear fallout land in their regions. The outrage for how bad this fucking thing went was exactly what caused them to all sit down and talk about whether or not they were going to allow atmospheric testing for nuclear weapons anymore.
Whoa.
Yeah, and it took a minute, but in the end, they wound up deciding that atmospheric testing was outlawed for the rest of human history. They're not supposed to be done above ground anymore, underground or underwater. I think it's shifted to only underwater at this point.
What? You can test it underwater? Wouldn't that ruin, like, the fish and stuff down there?
I mean, it's going to kill a bunch of fish,
and
for
that
sure.
water is going to move.
It's going to go somewhere, but the more they've increased the yield of these devices, the more they've tried to reduce the radioactive fallout. The largest bomb in human history is the Tsar Bomb, TSAR, that Russia detonated, which was 50 megatons.
Where did they detonate that one?
In Russia, in like the middle of fucking nowhere. That bomb is scary big. It didn't have a whole lot of problems like this one did, or Russia just didn't talk about them. One of the two. But when it comes to this particular one, the fallout basically wrapped all the way around the world. It stayed at the tropical areas in the most part, but it was detected all around the globe. They formed this committee to basically research everywhere to see whether or not fallout was landing, and basically everywhere they set up a center to investigate it, they found it. However, back then in like 1954, the early 50s, mid 50s, late 50s, there wasn't a lot of advanced technology for detecting things like this. It was really just a way to measure whether or not something was radioactive. And it wasn't, the best system. What they did find out was that the amount of exposure that landed in Japan was not the most significant amount of exposure outside of the tropical zone. Outside of the tropical zone, the place that was most affected, and this is very ironic to me because of how far away it was the southwestern United States. It had 5 times the amount of fallout reach it than Japan did, even though it was so close to it because the winds were blowing mostly northeast. So it's like the radiation knew where it had come from and decided that it wanted to go home to New Mexico. And it was a significant find when they realized, wow, it floated halfway across the world and wound up settling in the southwestern region of the United States of America.
That's nuts.
After that, they still conducted their other 6 tests over the course of 44 days. They just kept going with it. Those went better. They didn't have significant fuck-ups. They did extend their safety radius, basically, to make sure they were taking this thing seriously after how bad Castle Bravo went. It remains, to this day, the 5th largest weapon detonation in human history.
Wow.
And it was such a massive fucking mistake that ruined the lives of so many people in that region. It also was a major source of inspiration for protests, especially within Japan, to stop nuclear testing. And that sort of backdrop became the inspiration for a movie series known as Gojira, along with the testing that was done, or not the testing, excuse me, but the actual bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the idea of what radiation can do. And that thread is still present in most of the iterations of Godzilla, like the one that came out in 2018, 2017. They state that the Castle Bravo, all 7 of those bombs, were an attempt to kill Godzilla. And that's why they picked that specific region, and that's why the bombs were so powerful, is because they were actually trying to kill him. So it's just a common thread that keeps coming back. And it's funny because when America makes a Godzilla movie, those bombs were actually a good thing. When Japan makes a Godzilla movie, those bombs and how big of a fucking mistake they were is what created Godzilla. So it's always interesting to see how these things affect cultures differently, especially when it's like, oh, that's still a pretty nice version, like ignoring the actual fallout, again, no pun intended, of how bad Castle Bravo went. But yeah, that is the story of Castle Bravo.
That's very interesting. I did not know that. I didn't even realize that when I watched Godzilla, and I've watched it so many times.
I will say, man, like nuclear fallout is one of the most terrifying things to me. I've watched so many simulation videos of like, what happens if World War III kicks off and nuclear weapons are used? Just thinking like, maybe it'll be isolated or maybe there's a region in the world I can escape to. Basically, if you go to the southernmost tip of South America, you might not get as affected, but like everything in the northern hemisphere is a radioactive fucking wasteland for decades, and it's just so scary to think about. So when I was reading this, I was like, they were literally testing shit and they spread radiation all over the globe. How do you think it would work if they started shooting these fucking things?
Well, that's why there's like NATO and stuff now, right?
Yeah, and disarmament. Either way, that is my story. That is Castle Bravo. And before we move into our next topic, we are going to take a quick commercial break.
All right. Welcome to my half of the episode, I guess. I don't know if mine is as depressing as yours. It's pretty depressing, but not as like, oh my God, nuclear weapons depressing. So this week I wanted to cover some true crime, and there's been a topic that we have been putting off for a long while, probably since we started the show. And it's a pretty famous topic, and that is H Holmes and his murder castle. So many of us have probably heard of H Holmes, household name, right? Famous con artist, and oh yeah, serial killer. Serial killer is not necessarily what he was, because serial killer is like you have to kill X amount of people within a certain amount of time, but he has killed multiple people.
Is he a mass murderer? Is that a better term for him? I don't know what the limit is to be a mass murderer.
There has to be levels. Yeah, there has to be levels for you to be a mass murderer. I'm not sure. That's definitely something to look into. But you probably have heard of H Holmes. If you like true crime, you have heard this name before. So Dr. Henry Howard Holmes was born May 16th, 1861. I don't know if that is same zodiac as you or what. Okay.
Yep, my zodiac goes all the way till May 20th. He is a Taurus.
Okay, yep.
And that's kind of funny because I've always seen those memes where it's like serial killers and their zodiacs, and not a lot of them are Tauruses. I had no fucking clue H Holmes was a Taurus.
What is strange about this whole story, this whole topic that I'm going to go through is there are a lot of dates that revolve around June, July, May, and December.
And December too, huh?
Yeah, it's really weird. It's like summer months and then December that are 4th of July shows up a couple times. It's very strange.
It's like holidays and birthdays for this guy were a trigger, apparently.
Or something. Maybe, you know what? Maybe that is what it was. Who knows?
People get depressed around Christmas time.
But he was born as Herman Webster Mudgett. That was his original name. He was born in Gilmanton, New Hampshire. And he was born to a couple descendants of English immigrants in the area. So his family, both his mom and dad, came from English immigrants. He had an older sister named Ellen, an older brother named Arthur, and two younger siblings, Henry and Mary. So his father came from a farming background, worked in farming, trading, even did house painting, very modest, you know. His parents were devout Methodists, so very Christian. It's a branch of Christianity. And I'm assuming they raised him up in that environment. There are those that like to describe his childhood as being one filled with him having tortured animals or suffering abuse from his father to kind of make him fit in that little that quote unquote typical serial killer pattern, right? But eyewitness accounts that have been written in that time portray his childhood as not necessarily being that way at all. So when it comes to H Holmes, it's a lot of legend and lore and people making stories bigger than they were. But when Holmes was 16, graduated from the Phillips Exeter Academy. I don't know if you've heard of that before, but that academy is a pretty prestigious academy.
I think I've heard the word Exeter before in like relation to something like that.
It's a highly selective private boarding school, and students that graduate from this high school are known to move on to really notable colleges and universities like Harvard or Dartmouth, Princeton, stuff like that. A lot of politicians have gone to that boarding school.
It's one of those places.
Yeah. So in 2018 to 2019, in that academic school year, tuition for this school was $55,000 for the year.
What year was this again?
2018 to 2019.
Okay. I thought that was going to be like 1950 and
No,
then it
no,
would
no.
scale up to something like
No.
$1 million.
No.
This is for a high school.
This is just it. I think it's not just high school. It's
more of those
yeah.
things. Gotcha. It's like it's like a normal boarding school,
right.
but just for like super rich people that want to take over the world.
55,000 for the year. That is, you could buy a really nice ass car. You could buy 3 really crappy cars.
You can buy 10 and a half. You can buy 5.5 houses in 1954 for that, or 1953.
All right, so it's pretty insane. So once he graduated, he took some teaching jobs in town, nearby areas. On July 4th, 1878, he marries a girl named Clara Lovering in Alton, and they had a son on February 3rd, 1880, just a little under 2 years after they got married. And they had him in Loudon, New Hampshire. His son went on to become a public accountant and served as the city manager of Orlando, Florida, supposedly. Housemates described Holmes as actually having treated Clara violently, like he was not the best husband to her. When he was 18, he enrolls at the University of Vermont in Burlington, but leaves that school a year later. In 1882, he enters the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery. And when I read that, I was just like, maybe that's a sign of his like underlying desire to get his hands on the human body, you know, where
Right.
it's like maybe he has those killing urges and that's how he wants to like kind of ease his way into it. But before his graduation, Clara moves to New Hampshire away from him and later writes that she knew little of him afterwards. So she moves away from him, doesn't contact him again. She's just like, whatever, taking my kid, I'm good. He graduates June 1884. While in school, he works in the anatomy lab with Professor William James Herman, and legend has it that the two of them actually partnered up to rob graves to supply the school with medical cadavers.
I feel like that is a common thing that people are accused of in older. I hate the phrase olden times, but realistically, I think I've had that in my scripts, like at least twice in like my last 10 scripts.
The medical cadaver thing.
People from their past will be like, I think they used to like rob graves.
So he goes on to apprentice in New Hampshire under Nahum Wright, a known advocate of human dissection. So if you're wondering, dissection means to dismember and cut into pieces. So this guy was into cutting people up.
And this wasn't a last resort.
God damn it.
Cut my life into pieces.
It's more like cutting their bodies into pieces. In 1886, while he's still married to Clara, who's left him, you know, he marries someone named Myrta Belknap, and she was 24. He was only a little over a year older than her. So
Okay.
it's not like he's, you know, marrying someone half his age, but he's still married to Clara. So still married to Clara, marries this other girl. Only after he marries her does he file for divorce from Clara, alleging her infidelity. So it's
Wow.
like, she's cheating on me. I want a divorce. Surviving documentation on the filings indicate that she actually probably never even heard anything about these filings at all.
They just granted him a divorce because he
Nope.
filed paperwork?
Nope. So they never hear anything about the suit. their divorce is never finalized.
Oh, wow.
It's dismissed June 4th, 1891. He has a daughter with Murda that he names after his mother. It's like Lucy Theodate, whatever his last name was at the time, because he changed his name and it gets real confusing. But yeah, middle name of this child names after his mom.
Okay.
So they have this daughter July 4th, 1889 in Chicago. So that's the second time you see July 4th so far in this.
It's kind of weird.
Yeah. They have her in Chicago, Illinois. She becomes a school teacher, apparently, which is super cute. And then January 17th, 1894, he marries a girl named Georgiana Yoke while still married to his previous wives. So he has 3 wives at this point. Divorced from none of them.
That's a lot of wives, my dude.
Yeah. When Holmes became suspected of murder, he claims that he was nothing more than committing insurance fraud in all of these. So he admits to using cadavers to defraud insurance companies several times in college. Rumors spread that when he moved to New York, he had actually been seen with a little boy who later went missing.
That's so fucked up.
According to Holmes, the boy had gone back to his home in Massachusetts, and then no investigation took place.
So it was just like, all right, sounds good.
So Holmes just left town. So he later travels to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, gets a job as a keeper at Norristown State Hospital, quits after a few days. He gets a job at a drugstore in Philly, works there. A boy dies after taking medicine purchased at that store. Holmes, of course, denies any involvement, then leaves the city immediately.
Wow.
Then he moves to Chicago, August 1886. When he gets there, he manages to change his name to Henry Howard Holmes. That's when he changes his name. So supposedly, he changes his name as an homage to Sherlock Holmes.
Wow.
Because he is obviously up his own ass.
He's the kind of guy Sherlock Holmes would have put away.
Yeah. So he changes his name supposedly to avoid being exposed by victims of his previous scams, because he has committed all this insurance fraud and things like that in the past.
And just randomly poisoned some people.
Yeah. So he begins working at Elizabeth S. Holton's drugstore, where he proved to be a pretty hardworking employee and eventually buys the store from her.
Oh, wow.
There are rumors, there were like legends, right, that Holmes murdered the couple, but it is just a myth. They actually lived well into the 20th century. So it's like a lot of people making up these fictional stories about who he may have murdered, or
to like feed the legend,
right,
to like make it even more than it is.
Yeah. So he purchases an empty lot across from the drugstore and begins constructing a 2-story mixed-use building in 1887. So it included apartments on the second level, and then retail spaces, and then a new drugstore as well. So Holmes was actually sued at one point for not paying the architects or the steel company that worked on his building. He's sued in 1888. This guy is just a piece of work.
Yeah, no matter what he's doing, he always finds a way to be a piece of shit.
In 1892, he adds a 3rd floor to the building, and this 3rd floor is intended as like a hotel addition to the building, but it never gets completed fully. Stories of H. Holmes portray that this hotel addition as being kind of like a lure for the tourists, because in Chicago, they had the World's Fair, right? So World Fair is going on here.
It's a big deal.
It's a big deal. They like introduced the Ferris wheel there, I guess. And I've never really read too much into it, but it seems like there were so many things that happened at the World Fair.
It is very much like the scene in the movie Captain America, where they go and they attend the fair and they see like
Howard
technologies
Stark shows,
of tomorrow.
Yeah, okay, got it.
And Stark does the floating car that doesn't work thing, yeah.
It doesn't work. He did say in the future.
Yeah.
Okay, so people think that he built this hotel addition to kind of lure those tourists coming in for the World's Fair in order to murder them and sell their skeletons or bodies or whatever to medical schools. This, however, is just a story. It's all fictional stories, like a lot of things. And there really is no evidence that he ever actually tried to lure strangers into his hotel for the sole purpose of murdering them. There was no evidence to actually convict him.
Okay.
Found at this murder castle. Media dubbed Holmes's building as the murder castle. They claimed that, and of course it's media, right? This newspapers and stuff like that want to make it out to be more than it is so that people will buy your paper. But they claimed that his building had secret torture chambers, trap doors, gas chambers, even a crematorium in the basement. None of these were actually true. The legends were spread that this building contained over 100 rooms and was laid out like a maze, kind of like the Winchester Mystery House, where there would be doors that opened up to brick walls or stairs to nowhere, or just a bunch of windowless rooms, when in reality it was all pretty unremarkable, typical, just floor of rooms. There were some hidden rooms, but they were used more as kind of like storage rooms, and rooms used for hiding goods that he was buying with like the insurance money and stuff like that, where he was defrauding insurance companies.
Right. So I'm curious, you're probably going to get to this, but when did they start writing this stuff about him? Was there an event that popped off where he got in big trouble and then they started writing it? Or did they just start talking shit about this dude who had this building?
So I will get there. Okay. So the building did have a 1-story factory that Holmes claimed was for glass bending. But there, of course, are legends that he actually used it to destroy evidence of his crimes, which is probably why the news outlets were like, it's a crematorium in the basement when it's a glass, bending factory thing. Some say he killed as many as 200 people in the building, but that is debated, of course. Holmes was caught, having been tracked down from Philadelphia by the private Pinkerton National Detective Agency, who you've covered in the past, I believe, right? Or have talked about.
I've mentioned them, in passing about some investigations that they did.
Yeah, so sure. Pinkerton agents are famously known for apparently having foiled an assassination plot against Abraham Lincoln. And he actually hired them for his personal security during the Civil War.
Worked out for a minute.
Yeah, right. I mean, you can't foil them all.
Can't win them all. 2 out of 3 ain't bad, guys.
Jesus. Holmes was held on an outstanding warrant for horse theft in Texas. So he stole a horse while he was down in Texas.
They don't take that shit lightly in Texas.
I guess not. They just really needed anything to hold him because they were growing really suspicious of him as a person. It really seemed like he was just about to flee the country with his third wife, who had no idea about any of the things going on in his life. None of his supposed victims were really strangers, which is why I said earlier, he didn't really lure strangers into his building just to kill them. It seemed like he knew a lot of the people that he murdered. So,
as is often the case with violent crimes.
Yeah. So after his arrest, Holmes claims to have killed his former medical school classmate, Robert Lee Koch, in 1886 for insurance money.
Can you say that name one more time for me?
Lee Koch.
Okay, cool.
So it turns out, however, that he had actually died in Whitford, Ontario, Canada on October 5th, 1889. So Holmes would say, oh, I killed this person and I killed this person. And it would turn out that they had never died. Kind of like how people thought that he killed that couple that owned the pharmacy or the drugstore. But
so it's possible that some of the bullshit that's been fed into his legend was fed into it by himself.
Yeah.
Since he seems just like one of those sociopaths where even if they have committed terrible crimes, will tell you that they've committed shit that they haven't done at all.
Right.
Just to sort of make themselves feel more important.
I think that was kind of his personality. He wanted to be this big fancy dude, doctor guy. But he must have been doing really well. He was able to build a 3-story building. Granted,
when you don't
he didn't pay anyone.
You don't pay the contractors, the architects. Yeah, it's pretty easy to get shit built.
So we all know from his history of wives that this guy's kind of a player. you know.
Wow.
He likes them ladies. So one of his early victims was one of his mistresses, Julia Smith. So she moves into this building, works at the drugstore's jewelry counter. She'd been married, until her husband found out that she was cheating on him with Holmes. He dips, leaves her and her daughter, and...
That's fucked up. He left the daughter, too?
Yeah.
Wow.
So, Christmas Eve, 1891, they go missing. According to Holmes, she had died during an attempt at an abortion, and he had no experience with them. And at that time in history, death during these types of procedures wasn't uncommon.
Right.
And he also claimed to have poisoned Pearl, the daughter, to hide their situation. So he poisoned her because she was going to start asking questions about the fact that her mom died. So he's just like, poison them, get rid of them both, avoid that, So while excavating the cellar of this murder castle, a skeleton of a small child was found. That may have been that of Pearl because it seems around the same size of a child that age. Her father, Ned, would be a key witness in his trial, even though, he ditched them both. Another woman by the name of Emmeline Sigrand began working in the building May of 1892. She went missing that December. Rumor has it that she had also gotten pregnant by Holmes.
Jesus.
And that she too fell victim to an abortion gone wrong. If you're not good at it, why do you keep trying to do it? I don't get it.
Why do you keep impregnating women if you're just going to murder them?
Yeah, hello, pull out, Jesus.
Pull out game is weak, H Holmes.
In 1893, an actress named Minnie Williams moved to Chicago. Holmes claimed to have met her through an employment office, but there were also rumors that he had met her in Boston years earlier. She worked at the hotel as his personal stenographer, kind of like an assistant, I guess, typing all the stuff for him.
Right.
He talks her into transferring her property in Fort Worth, Texas to him, but not directly to him. He gives her like an alias, like transfer it to the name of this person, and it's one of his aliases, Alexander Bond. What the fuck? It's like, what? So Holmes plays notary. He is the one that notarizes this freaking document to himself.
He notarizes a document of property being transferred to his own alias.
This is probably where he stole the horse, in Fort Worth, Texas somewhere, right? He later transfers the property to a Benjamin Pitezel under the alias Benton T. Lyman. That is the other guy's
Lyman.
So this Pitezel person is a man who has been described as Holmes's quote-unquote tool and creature. So Minnie's sister Annie comes to visit July of 93. She writes to her aunt that she's going to accompany Minnie and, Holmes to Europe. Neither Minnie nor Annie are seen past July 5th, 1893.
So again, around this exact same time.
Mm-hmm. He must
His
be
murder
triggered,
boner,
man.
really gets going from the birth of our nation.
All I'm thinking of is Hamilton right now. Okay, so Holmes leaves Chicago July of 1893 because he had insurance companies kind of breathing down his neck for arson. That's when he heads to Fort Worth, spends time on the property he got from the Williams, without the Williams. Probably where he stole a horse. He attempts building another structure there, but no murders ever took place on that property. Holmes began getting around in July of 1894. His cons and crimes start putting him on the radar of authorities. So he keeps coming up with plans to swindle these insurance companies. He wants to take an insurance policy on his own life and fake his own death. But unfortunately for him, insurance companies are like, you're too sus. We're not paying you. That's not happening. Then Pitezel, his little minion dude, agrees to fake his own death so that his wife could collect on the $10,000 life insurance policy on him. She is then to split that with Holmes and then their lawyer that kind of cooked the whole thing up, right? Instead of faking the death in a lab explosion, Holmes decides to straight up kill him by drugging him with chloroform and then setting his body on fire.
Oh my God.
He collects on the payout from the dude's wife. He gets Pitezel's wife, to place 3 of their 5 children in Holmes's custody.
No.
I don't know
my
how.
God.
She is none the wiser of her husband's actual death. He eventually kills all 3 of these children.
What the fuck is wrong with this guy?
Yeah, he placed Alice and Nellie, the 2 girls, in a large trunk, and it was like a large trunk, put them in there, had a hole, put a gas line into that hole and suffocated them.
What? I mean, I get he's sick. I get there's something very wrong with this human being. But why is he like, yeah, just give me some of your kids to kill?
I don't get it. I don't get how this woman's like, oh yeah, take 3 of my kids, no big.
I'll keep 2, you take 3.
I mean, she eventually is like, where's my kids? And they are reported like missing, you know. But so he buries them in a rental house in Canada. When he kills Howard, the last of the 3 children, he dismembers and burns the body and buries it in a rented cottage. So wherever he rents, he's just like, bury here. Like, he is just a mess. And evidence of all the murders were found upon investigation by Frank Geyer, a Philadelphia police detective who was assigned to investigate Holmes and the 3 missing children, because he took them all the way to Canada. And it's just that she's obviously going to wonder where her kids are, you know, and it's just nuts. So in July of 1895, when evidence of Alice and Nellie's bodies were found, Chicago police and reporters went straight into investigating the murder castle. And I say murder castle, but it wasn't necessarily like a murder castle, because again, there wasn't a bunch of convicting evidence there. In October of 1895, Holmes was put on trial for the murder of Pitezel. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. So evidence of the murdered missing children had already been found at this point. Holmes confessed to 27 murders spread between Chicago, Indianapolis, and Toronto. Though, like I said earlier, some of these confessions were for people that were still very much alive.
Well done. He seems like he would be a Slytherin for sure.
During his time waiting for his trial and sentencing, oh my god, if there are people out there who are like, oh my god, I don't even know what movie that's from or whatever.
That's a pretty memorable line reading. Very much alive.
So during his time waiting for his trial and sentencing, he authors a book, like an autobiography called Holmes. Holmes' own story. So in this...
has such a fucking boner. I hate him so much.
In this, he wrote, quote, "I could not help the fact that I was a murderer no more than the poet can help the inspiration to sing," end quote. Like, what a tool bag. Holmes was hanged on May 7th, 1896, at the Philadelphia County Prison for the murder of Pitezel. Throughout the process, Holmes remains calm and amiable, which means, you know, he's good spirits the whole time. He didn't seem afraid or disturbed. He even went as far as to ask that his coffin be contained in cement and buried 10 feet deep because he didn't want his body to be taken by grave robbers, which is so ironic. His neck did not break upon hanging. He strangled to death slowly over 15 minutes. And was
he earned it, for sure.
Yeah, he was pronounced dead 20 minutes after the initial drop. He was buried in an unmarked grave in Holy Cross Cemetery in Philadelphia. So, soon after his arrest in Boston on November 17th, 1894, the hotel was set on fire in August of 1895 by a pair of unknown arsonists. It's reported that someone saw like 2 men walk in, do something, and come right out. And then the building is set on fire. It was gutted, but then rebuilt and used as a post office until 1938, after which it was demolished, I believe. So Patrick Quinlan, a former caretaker of the castle, committed suicide in March of 1914 by taking strychnine. His body was found in his bedroom with a note that read, "I couldn't sleep," which is
creepy.
Terrifying.
Yeah.
His relatives claim that he had been, quote unquote, haunted for several months and was suffering from hallucinations. I don't know if they had anything to do with the fact that he was caretaker at that castle, but maybe he saw some things. Who knows? In 2017, it was rumored that Holmes had escaped execution. And so they, and I say they as in his surviving descendants that lived in the area, exhumed his body for testing. And because it was interred in concrete, his clothes were perfectly preserved, and even his mustache was still intact. But he was positively identified based on dental record that it was him. They should have run like some type of DNA on his mustache or something, because if you have descendants that are still alive, like they'd have some markers that were similar.
DNA wasn't discovered for a long time later. So
this is 2017.
Oh, this is 2017. I thought you said 1917. Yeah,
no.
They should have run DNA or something like that.
Yeah. So, if you want to read a pretty good book about H Holmes, I recommend The Devil in the White City by Eric Larson.
I had no idea it was about him until you told me it was about him.
Yeah. So Eric Larson writes some really good historical books. I definitely recommend it. Some pretty good shit. But yeah, that's the story of H Holmes and the murder castle.
It's very fascinating. I will say, I was not as impressed with the murder castle portion of it.
And that's when I was doing it too. I was like, it's not really a murder castle, and he kind of sucks at murder. People make him out to be this big, horrific dude who murdered hundreds of people, but
con man shit, like combined with murders of opportunity, constant. It's like he doesn't even have a specific MO. It's just like,
no.
Is there a person near him? Yes, he's either gonna fuck them or kill them. In some cases, both.
He is definitely like just a con artist, and he's able to pull off these things, and kind of like how cult leaders are able to talk people into doing the craziest stuff. He somehow is able to talk people into doing that. And I find that absolutely fascinating. I don't know how people do it, but
yeah. Absolutely. He is a despicable, disgusting human being, and we're still talking about him over a century later. Mm-hmm. So it is sad. I'm shocked they honored his wishes of interring him in concrete and burying him 10 feet deep. I would bury him 10 feet deep just because he's closer to hell that way, but
holy shit.
It's just bizarre. Like, the entire story, I understand, is pretty morbid, but to honor the guy's final wishes, I get it. They're final wishes, and people have some very different ways of like believing in certain things being honored and stuff like that, but it's like that scene in The Mummy where it's like, any last request is like, yeah, loosen the knot and let me go. Like, how far do you go with honoring last request?
Okay,
yeah. He's not someone that I feel like deserved that. But it was really, really well researched. Good shit, Robin.
Yeah, thank you, Internet.
Yeah, good job, Internet. Shout out to you. I think that's everything we have for this episode of Scaryish. If you have a story you would like to send us, could be true crime, could be supernatural, could be coincidental, extraterrestrial in nature, doesn't have to be related to our topics today. We would love to hear from you. Feel free to reach out by emailing storytime@scaryish.com or going to our website, scaryish.com, and clicking on contact us. Fill out that form. It does come directly to us. Robin, actually, no, you can also hit us up on social medias before I say that. At Scaryish Podcast is Instagram, at Scaryish Pod is Twitter, and Facebook.com/Scaryish Podcast is Facebook. Robin, for folks who would like to donate to us, how can they do so?
You can go to patreon.com/Scaryish Podcast. Tiers start at $1. At $1, you get ad-free episodes, which is great. You can also go to ko-fi.com/Scaryish Podcast, and those are one-time donations. We're really thankful for everybody who has donated to us and kind of helped keep this show going. And we love all of our spooky friends.
Indeed. So thank you so much for listening to this particular episode. We hope you enjoyed it. That is everything we have. So Robin, do your thing and sign us out.
Keep on creeping on, and we'll talk to you guys later.
Bye-bye.